start with is by making a correction and giving an apology to Sister Andrea, okay? Because she was correct, I was wrong. Granada fell in 1492, as she had stated. I said 1453 because I coupled it with the fall of Constantinople, and that was wrong. Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, falls. It's conquered and taken over by 1492. But at some point in time, because it does involve a large degree of Africans in this circumstance, Berbers, we want to take a look at what is called the Reconquista in Spanish, or the reconquest of Spain by the Christians, because at the time, if you look at the map, at the time that Granada falls, you would not have thought, you would have looked at it and said that there's no way possible that the Muslims had controlled Spain for as long as they did. I mean, it's not just that Granada falls. Granada is the very last Islamic city, fortification, outpost, whatever you want to call it. It's the last presence of Islamic rule in Spain when it falls in 1492. Okay, so, it's everything else in Spain has been retaken. And it's really important to note that fact, okay, that whereas when you begin looking at Spain, there's I'll get the link on YouTube, and it shows you the degree of the extent of Muslim conquest, and which is primarily Berber, although they would call it Moors, those combination ethnicity of those individuals, part Berber, quote unquote, part African and part Arab, the extent of their conquest, all of Spain practically, except a small area, is under Muslim control, under what it now becomes the Caliphate of Cordoba, in which is called, or the second Umayyad dynasty. Either one is the same, but there's only a small sliver of Spain that's not under, Muslim control. Then in 1221, 1225, this phenomenon that is referred to as the reconquest of Spain begins. And so from 711 up until 1492, the fall of Granada, it gives you a rolling look at how the Muslims lost territory. So this reconquest of Spain doesn't happen overnight. It's almost 300 years in taking place. But the successful end, as far as Catholics are concerned, and notice I said Catholics and not of the Christians, as far as Catholics are concerned, and Catholicism is the dominant religion, Christian religion in Spain. There is no other. It's, the fall of Granada is still a day that they celebrate. And that, so Sister Andrea, I just wanted to, bring that out and say, I was wrong, you were correct. Okay. Granada did fall in 1492. Okay.
Okay, but no apology is needed.
Okay, thank you. Okay. It's a horrendous time for Muslims. And so when we look at the Almohads, we want to pay very close attention to them, because we'll get a chance to see what happens with Muslims when there are controversies and dichotomies that come into existence about certain aspects of Islam. Okay, and why it's very important for us to understand the Arabic or Islamic names given to these groups as such, because of the things that happen. It would be just simply to say that the reconquest was successful because Muslims started doing X, Y, Z and not looking at it in specifics. I think there's some things here we need to look at in terms of specifics, because it's those specifics that gives us an idea, looking presently, a lot of intra-Islam, the circumstances that adversely affect our being Muslims and the unity that we should have. And at the same time, it points to a very important aspect about how Islam spreads in the rest of Africa. Okay, and ideologies that that go forth, that go throughout Africa, and some people adhere to them and some don't. And the question becomes, in what we look at, how closely did it really ally to the Quran and the Sunnah as intended by Allah and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or were there some dichotomies, some things that entered into these discussions that caused some dissension? And then you have things happening like, well, and looking at the Reconquest, we'll see that you have one of the Umayyad rulers, or from the Caliphate of Cordoba, seeking, aligning himself with the Christians against another, Muslim ruler within times of Spain, and saying that from that point on, when he did it, he would always support, Aragon, Castile, and Navarre, these three strong, very strong Christian provinces that become the center point of the Reconquest, and where it stems from. So we want to take a look at that. So any questions from last week? At all? Any comments? Okay. What I want you to do, because I like for it to be as interactive as possible, go online at any source you want to and look up the name Almohads. Oh, and to spell it, Almohads. A-L, make sure I spell it right myself, A-L.
Almohad Caliphate.
Yes, Almohad Caliphate.
A-L-M-O-H-A-D.
Right, A-L-M-O-H-A-D.
And after Al-Mu'min.
Mm-hmm. And give me just a second. Mm-hmm.
Caliphate. Caliphate.
Okay, what did you find?
Oh, I think that were they Berbers?
Yes, very important.
What did she say?
She said that they were Berbers, and I said very important. Okay, which is saying if they're Berber, it meant that what, in the true sense of the word, they were African. Anything else that it says about them? What's the Arabic name for them? What are they called? If you found it.
Is it Banu Abd al-Mumin?
Banu al-Mu'min. Correct. Okay, that's one. They're also called the al-Muhaddithin. Okay, al-Muwahidun, because another word in Arabic for one is wahid. In English, W-A-H-I-D. You have ahad as Allah's description, al-ahad, which means the one, and then you have wahid, W-H-I-D, that means one, two. So here it is the people of Abd al-Mu'min. Okay, and then they're also called al-Muhaddithin or al-Muhaddithun. Okay, meaning some say the monotheist or the unifiers. Okay, and this name al-Muhaddithun comes from this Banu Abd al-Mu'min. Okay, now Banu Abd al-Mu'min. Okay, these were North African Berber Muslims, African. All right, and this empire, or the al-Muwahhidun empire, is founded in the 12th century. Okay, it will be more successful than the Almoravids, who they overthrow. But they have a particular type of, in terms of the madhab that they follow. We're always told that in North Africa, al-Maghrib, meaning all the North, the West, okay, that the Maliki school of thought was the predominant school of thought. But an individual that we're going to look at who was in the forefront of this movement, of the al-Muhaddithun, are against the Maliki school. And so we're going to look at what some has said was the fifth school of thought as far as Sunni Islam was concerned, and some rejected it altogether. Okay, but the individuals here that we're talking about, okay, had some problems with the Maliki school. Okay, so if we look at them just to give some date lines.
What was the school that they were?
The school, we're going to get to it. Okay. These individuals, they're different tribes of Berbers, and they control different areas within North Africa. But for who we're looking at now, their caliphate is, the capital is called Tinmil, Tinmel, 1121 to 1147. They take control of Marrakesh from another group of Berbers in 1147 and control it until 1269. And we'll talk about that. In Spain, because they do cross the Mediterranean again and commence what one could call the reconquest in Islamic terms of Spain. And they have the cities of Seville and Cordoba that they control. They will control Seville and Cordoba both until 1248. And 1248 signals the end of the Al-Muwaddithun Caliphate. Okay? The language is spoken in this area controlled by the Al-Muwaddithun are Arabic and Berber. And there's a third dialect we called Mos Arabic. Haven't been able to put a definite figure on just how to describe what this is. But the two major languages spoken are Arabic and Berber, which again points to the fact that, unlike what many historians have tried to say, the Berbers were not Arab. They're an entirely different ethnicity, African all the way through. First recorded presence about them is in Africa, not somewhere else. Okay? And the language that they speak is not attuned to Arabic in any shape, way, form, or fashion. And possibly most Arabic, some of the research I've seen has said that it was a blending in some type of way of Berber and Arabic. In some senses, for lack of a better a way of saying it, you have what is called Spanglish, which is this, especially among some Spanish youngsters, they speak this blend of languages. You know, it's not all Arabic, it's not all Spanish, it's a blend of the two. You know, and they'll switch from one from the other in the course of having a conversation. Okay. Now, the person who starts this movement, his name is Ibn Tumart. Ibn, capital I-B-N, Tumart, capital T-U-M-A-R-T. He's a very interesting individual. He's Berber through and through. And he begins his education, his Islamic education, in Marrakesh, and then in Fez, and then he goes to Baghdad. Okay, so he's going through all the principal places of learning to acquire Islamic knowledge. But he develops this idea. He has a problem with Allah's attributes and how they are described or explained in Islamic classes and texts. He thinks that, you know, if you, in any shape, way, form, or fashion, explain one of Allah's attributes, even if it's in a manner for humans to be able to understand, and not just accept it the way that it is without giving any explanation to it, that if Allah says he has a hand, he has a hand. You don't try to explain what it is or come up with any explanation or anything like this, then he has a problem with individuals who do, or who try to. And he has a problem with the Maliki school of thought because of the concept of ijma, the aspect of agreeing, you know, of consensus amongst the scholars on different points. He says that before that takes place, every ounce of energy should be applied to make sure that there's just not a clear circumstance to be determined in the Quran and the Sunnah that, you know, makes ijma unnecessary. And then it's up to the Muslims to follow what is said there explicitly. It doesn't need an explanation as such. He goes from place to place talking about this circumstance. And ultimately, he ends up taking refuge in the Atlas Mountains. Okay? And once he's there, and he has people coming to where he is, he takes refuge in a cave. And so once he has people coming to listen to him, you know, he's a fiery orator, and he does begin to gather, you know, adherents to his point of view. Okay. He's in the Atlas Mountains, and he declares himself to be the Mahdi. Okay. And now we've seen this happen before. Okay. We've seen this happen before. It will happen after him when we look at Sudan during the time of, you know, British colonialism and the revolt that takes place, or the attempt to kick the English out of Sudan. the person who will lead the Muslims to attempt to do this will refer to himself as being the Mahdi, and people believe that he is. Well, the same thing happens here with Ibn Tumar. People believe that he is the Mahdi, and he starts to get a large following of people. And a conscious decision is made is that the Almoravids, who are still in control, are deemed as being heretics. And this is something else that we will see. Enter the deen. One group will declare another group as being heretics, or their blood being lawful. The most latest manifestation of this terrible circumstance has been ISIS. Okay? In that circumstance, if you're not following who they consider to be the Khalifa, Abdul-Rahman al-Baghdadi, until his death, and what in the things that he's saying in his khutbahs, so forth and so on, then if you're not accepting what he's saying and you're giving, rebuttal to what he's saying and what they're doing, you're seen as a heretic. No ifs and buts about it. And so here, the same thing takes place, in that his followers begin to look at the Almoravids being heretics because of their adherence to and following, by and large, the Maliki school of thought as such. There's some problems because this is another circumstance where another school of thought comes about. And Ibn Tumart is behind the creation of it. He spends some time. Now we have to remember that if he's in Baghdad, okay, Baghdad was not Iraq then. Baghdad at one point in time was considered, when the Persian Empire is conquered by the Muslims, this includes Baghdad, okay? And within the confines of what's there, when it's conquered, Muslims establish some cities and add to Baghdad's importance. They established the cities of Basra, okay, and the cities of Kufa. Prior to the Muslim conquest of Persia, these two cities didn't exist, but they become the mainstay, two very important cities in the Islamic Ummah, along with Baghdad. And there's great, universities and everything and learning taking place. So I want you to look up this individual, Imam Zahiri. I'm sorry, Zahiri. 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 Mm-hmm. What do you find out about him? What does it say?
Dawood or Abu Talib. Dawood Zahiri.
Uh-huh. Ibn Tumar begins to take on some aspects about Zahiri's teachings. And the thing that is pointed out, whether they discuss it in what you've seen or not, is that part of Zahiri's teachings draw on Shiism as such. And for as a peculiar Tawhidist as Ibn Tumar deems himself, he doesn't find any problem with it, and he incorporates some of Zahiri's teachings into his own. Another person that has an influence upon Ibn Tumar is Al-Ghazali. Okay, so this leads to some problems, but nonetheless, Ibn Tumar gets a following. And then there's an attempt to overthrow the Almoravids, who are called the Almorabatun. And they descend into several provinces sacked them. They laid siege to a principal Almoravid city, and the Almoravids let the siege take place, and then they break out and they almost wipe out the Almohads, the Almohadithin, to a man. They say that it was over some 20,000 individuals who died in the Almoravids' attempt to wipe them out, but they don't. So Abd al-Mu'min, Bani Abd, the Abd al-Mu'min that they become known from, okay? He's the first person in terms of the Al-Muhaddithin to use this term, caliph. He declares himself as being caliph, okay? And from this point on, they will spread their influence. And the point I want to make here is that in spreading their influence, the individuals responsible for the brunt of the conquest that will take place by the Al-Muhaddithin, Muhaddithun, are Berbers, not necessarily Moors. Moors are inclusive in there, but the majority of the troops doing the fighting are Berbers, and this is an important point to understand. They go across the Straits of Gibraltar, and where the Almoravids have established control, they take it, and they reestablish and establish their control there. And they have a more successful time of holding on to it than the Almoravids did. However, so the Almohadithin established in 1121. They overthrow the Almoravids in 1147. And then there's another group of Berbers, and they're referred to as the Marinids. They come to serenity in 1248. However, the problem that the Almoravids have is that, if I'm remembering correctly, Muhammad III, he's called Al-Nasir, he attempts to expand northward again. And so this sort of gives us an indication of how strong the Christians had become. He attempts to go forward northward, and he runs into a alliance of 4 Christian provinces of Spain. Portugal is not an independent state at this time. It's part of Al-Andalus, it's part of Spain. But the Christians have regained control in the area called Portugal. The other 3 kingdoms, Christian provinces that combine against him are Navarre, spelled capital Navarre, Castile, capital Castille, Navarre, Castile, and Aragon, capital Aragon. These are 4 Christian Catholic provinces that Aragon and Castile never come under Muslim control, but Portugal had been, and Navarre had been. But by the time that this battle takes place, the Muslims have no control there at all. The battle is called the Battle of capital LAS, capital NAV as in Victor AS, lowercase capital DE, uppercase capital T, then lowercase OLOSA, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. Takes place in the year of 1212. And the Muslims are defeated. Some historians point to the fact that this loss begins in earnest the Christian attempt to retake and push the Muslims in Muslim political and military control in Al-Andalus. And from that point on, over the next, until the fall of Granada, which would be 280 years, this is how long the reconquest takes place. You know, the divisiveness amongst the Muslims is what made the reconquest in part easy, because there's a lot of interesting fighting. What had been the Caliphate, or the second Umayyad dynasty, it breaks up into a lot of individual Muslim kingdoms, and they fall piecemeal. In some instances, they have relationships with Aragon and Castile and Navarre. But there is, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. There's in Spanish history, when they talk about the reconquest, you have this figure called El Cid, name spelled E-L, then capital C-I-D. And some say he's fictional. Some say that's the name given to a Spanish knight of some notoriety. And questions about that. But there's a series on Amazon Prime that's called El Cid. And it's looking at this individual as a young man and his attempts to become a Spanish knight, and the intrigues and stuff that take place within these Christian kingdoms ruled by two brothers, looking at Castile and Aragon. And then you also have Navarre. So within the area that had been part of what is called the second Umayyad dynasty, or the Cordoba Caliphate, you have a city called Zaragoza, and it's controlled by Muslims. And in this particular circumstance, there is a push. There's warfare between the brothers that control Castile and Aragon. And so in an attempt to get one brother to overthrow the other, they began to retake territory, and they come to this city, Zaragoza. Zaragoza, Muslim control. And you see a scene in the picture where the chief administrator or wazir of the ruler of Zaragoza, Islamic ruler, he comes to Castile and he says, basically, look, your brother, has fallen upon us. We're not sending any more money to you until you provide the protection that we're paying for. And that right in itself points to a fact that was totally uncommon at the time. Okay, and this is the 12th century. That's totally uncommon at the time before that, of Muslims paying Christians for protection. The circumstance would have been that the Christians would have been paying the jizya, okay, as opposed to for Muslim protection and as such, as opposed to the Muslim paying tribute for Christian protection. Okay, there is a battle that takes place, and of course, the King Ferdinand of Castile, he sends a small amount of troops there. Anyway, they end up winning the battle, and his brother, who's King of Aragon, is killed. But what it shows is, to the extent that Muslims had began to lose control of Spain by the 12th century, into the mid 12th century and later. And then when this battle takes place in 1212, the reconquest takes place in earnest. So that by the time, over the next 200 years, 280 years, almost 300, all of Spain is retaken, and Granada is the lonely last Islamic presence on the Spanish peninsula. And what will happen to the Almohadithin is that they have problems amongst themselves. The last a Muhaddithin ruler is killed in 1269, and he's killed by a slave of his. Doesn't say what ethnicity the slave was in terms of being African or what, but that he's killed by a slave. And when that happens, that brings to an end what is known as the Al-Muhaddithun Caliphate or dynasty, however you want to take a look at it. Because once they are kicked out of Spain, they still control parts of Al-Maghrib, okay, the western parts of Al-Maghrib, which included Morocco, okay. But in 1269, when this last one of the Al-Muhaddithun rulers is killed, that is the end. They do not make a comeback from that. And that is, their presence is gone. But what we do want to look at, though, is, next is how they influenced the spread of Islam in Africa, because while Ibn Tumar is, basically almost like a hermit and people coming to him to be taught in the Atlas Mountains, there are individuals coming from other parts of Al-Maghrib and from other parts of Africa that are listening to him. And so what we want to determine is how much of a impetus was this in spreading of Islam into, say, Sudan, okay, and into other areas of Africa. How much of an influence was welded? Did he have disciples that went back to their people and were in there and began to talk about, Islam and the belief in Allah and the Prophet ﷺ? And, also how much of an impact did trade have in the spreading of Islam? And I'm not going to use the word in terms of Black Africa, because it's all Africa, just spread into the countries of Africa where, we look at Nigeria, how did that come about? The Sudan, okay, Egypt, okay. We know that in Egypt, it takes over a number of decades before Muslims become, in terms of population, the most populous in Egypt. But Egypt is African nonetheless, and the Coptic Christians it is. So how does the spread take place from there? What goes on, into these other areas? Who are the people responsible? Okay, are there movements? Are these disciples? Are they preachers? Are there, are they, tradesmen? As such, how does this happen? And so how do you get areas where Islam is, where Muslims are the most dominant, or you get a circumstance like Nigeria, where, depending on where you are in Nigeria, sort of determines what the dominant, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, what the dominant religion is in that particular area. Okay, so those are some of the things we want to look at. We want to look at the reconquest, in particular, because there are things that take place, that show that if it's the Muslims' internal weakness that leads to the Christians, the Catholics, being able to retake it, who have centered around two things: the royalty that is heading the reconquest and their undying hatred of Muslims. There's a scene in the series of when the troops from Castile get to Zaragoza, it's time for Salah. And so you begin to see what the impact that Islam had in terms of science and technology on the area. One of the Muslims who had been sent to talk to King Ferdinand, he brings out an astrolabe. How many of you know what an astrolabe is? Can somebody tell me? Because this was a Muslim invention that you don't hear a lot about. Anyone?
What did you say? An astrolabe?
Astrolabe. ASTROLABE. Labe.
Something to do with astrology, or I mean, with the not astrology, astronomy.
In a certain way, yeah. Okay.
A telescope.
Nope. Anybody else? Okay. The astrolabe was a Muslim invention that practically every historian of any worth looks at it as being the forerunner to the modern compass.
Compass. Oh,
Okay. To the modern compass. It's a way that can be used to determine whether sunlight or stars, how to find directions and how to navigate. And in this particular scene, this Muslim noble, he pulls out a small astrolabe and he uses it to determine the Qibla for them to pray. Okay. Now I'm going to preface this by saying we've all heard about how, under the rules of jihad and Islam, people were not allowed, were not forced to leave whatever they believed to become Muslim. And this scene points to the fact, without them even saying it, because this person who brings out the astrolabe to determine the direction of the Qibla, his right-hand man who assists him is Jewish. Is Jewish, okay? Is Jewish. And at the time, it's either Dhuhr or Asr, it's the time for him to pray as well. And he brings out what I would say to be a copy of the Torah. Everything about him says that he's Jewish, and he's praying. And the Muslims aren't bothering him at all. This ticks the Christians off to no end. So a Christian monk comes forward and begins to sing a hymn, a Catholic hymn. And he says to the soldiers, quote unquote, "Don't let these pagan infidels embarrass you or be louder than you are." So for him, the aspect about loudness is important. The louder that we sing, the more it deters them from praying, which wasn't true at all. They're singing and the Muslims are still making salat. And for once, in a circumstance of a movie production, let's say this production, the Muslims are praying as we know Muslims should pray. Okay? They call the adhan, the iqama, and they go forth. There's another scene that takes place where, in the same circumstance, the Muslims are having Salatul Jummah. There is a person sitting, there's an imam, and he's quoting from the Quran. And what he's saying to the Muslims that are gathered there, which ultimately hurts them, is your strength is with Allah and following the Sunnah. Calling upon non-believers to assist you is wrong as far as the Quran and the Sunnah are concerned. Okay, at the same time, in another area, somewhere else, there's a mass taking place, okay? And there's synagogues. So within this context, we see it's very good to see that they got it right in terms of Muslims being tolerant of other religions, but it also shows the extreme hatred and what's driving the reconquest at a time when Muslims begin to have problems with each other. And it makes it, even though it takes 282 years for the entire reconquest to take place, it does provide the Muslims not being together. You have Muslims aiding the Christians in the reconquest, only to end up with the aspect of being, finally being told, if you're going to stay here, you're going to be Catholic, or you have to leave. And with Granada being the last stronghold, which is the home of the Alhambra, falling in 1492. And from that standpoint, in 1492, once Granada is taken, Islam remains on the peninsula because you have people who stay. You have Spaniards who embraced Islam. So Islam is still there, but it doesn't have the presence of course, as it did when the majority of Spain was under its control. Okay. So is that any questions or anything?
Everybody fall asleep.
No, yes, Sister Andrea.
No, I was just letting you know I wasn't asleep.
Okay. Imam Radi, anything? They're not there.
He's not there.
No, I don't think so.
Maybe they went to make salat.
Probably it. It says participants 4. Oh, well, there's Sister Zakia.
I've been here. I just
I
been
know.
walking at the same time.
Okay.
Welcome, assalam.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Okay. So another thing we're going to look at is, like I said, the effects of the reconquest, but what other things are going on before we really get into looking at Africa that are affecting Muslims, because it becomes very important for us to know these things, and to see we can't depend upon, in all honesty, non-Muslims to give a proper accounting of what is Islamic history. And when it does happen, it's very unusual. Okay, it's the same thing like I've heard Talia say on more than one occasion, you can't expect Caucasians in many instances to give an accurate account about African history because they're not African. Okay, they may have an affinity for Africa, but they're not African. They have a different perspective about which they're going to talk about. And the same applies, to our history. And as history goes, some of it is outstanding and marvelous, and some of it is not. But in the whole, it's our history. And we have to take, be cognizant of it and know it, because it strengthens us, I believe, in seeing and looking at the Quran and the Sunnah in terms of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said and told us. Specifically the ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that indeed he does not change the condition of the people until they change that which is within themselves first. Okay? And we want to keep this in mind, as we go forward. There'll be some aspects of looking at African history which it's going to tear your heart apart to see the things that happen. Okay, the atrocities that take place during the period of colonization and and imperialism, and that, and then we look at the circumstance of what happens when Muslims are fighting against Muslims. Okay, because this is the one thing that the Prophet ﷺ, through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, said, this is the last thing that should be done. We know during the time that the fitna starts, and there are, during the reign of Ali, and there are, there's war between him and Muawiyah. A lot of the Muslims, including Bilal ibn Rabah, they simply leave and go somewhere else where the fighting is not happening. They're not going to stay there and stand by and watch and be involved in
it's 3 o'clock.
In the in the wars that take place. So those are some of the other things we're going to look at. Any questions, anything you want me to take a look at that you would like to discuss or want more clarification on or clarity, just let me know. Okay. Sister Andrea, anything?
No, can't think of anything right now.
Okay.
You're going to move into sub-Saharan Africa, right?
Yes. Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Because that becomes extremely important, looking at that, that era. Like I said, when you take a look at Sudan, for example, we'll look at in specifics how Islam gets there, how it spreads, okay? And that, the resistance to British expansion, is by the Muslims, okay? And so it gets some kind of idea about why does the dichotomy exist as it does today, Why did it end up being a North and a South Sudan? Okay, and how did that all come about? But yeah, we're going to definitely look at sub-Saharan Africa for sure. No doubt. No doubt whatsoever. Okay. Well, if you don't have any more questions, okay, thank you so much. It was a few of us, but a few is better than none, and I'll take it. Alhamdulillah. Okay. I enjoyed myself. I hope you did as well. And I'll see you next Sunday.
Okay.
Inshallah.
Alaikum.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum. See you the end of the week, Sheikh. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.